Welcome to this episode of Black Girl in the CLE, the podcast, and our new series, Let's Vote Cleveland. Well, Let's Vote CLE for short. In this series, we'll talk to people from local organizations and local residents about the issues and what's motivating them to vote in this upcoming election. We'll get started with this week's guest right after this. This episode is being produced without interruptions with support from a grant from the American Press Institute. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this episode of the Black Girl in CLE podcast and our Let's Vote Cleveland series. I'm your host, Shana Black, and today with me is my guest, Charesha Barrett of Charp Education. No, is it education or educational?
Education.
Education Consulting. Welcome to the show.
Good afternoon, Shana.
Thank you for being here. So for those of you who don't know Charesha has been just a major player in my life and on this business journey. So when I first started entrepreneurship, I reached out to Charesha because she was already like out there doing her thing. She had her business. And I'm like, I'm just starting, like, can we have coffee? I did the can we have coffee thing. Can I pick your brain? Which I now cringe, and I apologize for that. But then, you know, we stayed in touch. She helped be a founding blogger for Black Girl in CLE. And so she was one of our first writers, and she still got some amazing pieces on our site. So definitely check those out. But today we're talking about her work in her business, and especially in elections. And so one of the things that I've known about Charesha is while she prefers to do trainings about diversity and work with kids, and she's been an educator in the classroom and out, is that come election time, Charesha is out there. Like, she hits the street and becomes like super activist on a personal level. So it's not that she belongs to some organization and she has to do these things and she's volunteering. She just gets active. And that's kind of why I wanted to sit down with you, because I know that this time of year for you is super important. So if we can go back, do you remember your first election, like when you first voted or when you first registered? Like, how old were you?
So I remember the first time I voted for President Bill Clinton. And I was so excited because I grew up in a household where everyone voted. And I was excited because guess what? I'm an adult now. This is the first adult thing I was able to do. And so ever since then, I've always was passionate about voting.
So would you say that you became a voter because of your family, or was it school, or was it a mixture of things?
I think primarily my family. You know, Seeing my family, going to the voting booth, it was a commitment that they did every year or every couple years. And so when I saw that was the reason why I wanted to vote.
Cool. So let's go back, because I feel the same kind of way, and I've had conversations with people. Mm-hmm. And in our last episode, I was talking to Jennifer, and she says, I got her first election, I think, was President Obama. Mm-hmm. And I told her, I said, I have a hard time convincing people or having that conversation, you should vote, because I came from it from a totally different angle of you turn 18, you vote. Like, you turn 16 and you drive. How do you, as you have conversations, why do you think you're voting? So besides that, I turned 18, it's what we do in my family. What's kept you voting?
So I think we have to learn about the past. I'm a former social studies teacher, and I currently do anti-racism education. And a lot of times what I've noticed is that people just don't know history. Some people are not voting because they just don't understand the process. They don't understand the 3 branches of government. They don't understand why the census is important. And so for me as an educator, I'm always an educator. I'm a lifelong educator, regardless if I'm in the classroom or not. And we just have to figure out, how do we provide people who might not have the education, or a lot of times what I've noticed is like cycles that constantly perpetuate from one generation to the next, where my grandparents, not talking about my grandparents, but just thinking about people who have been in certain neighborhoods for 80 years and their grandparents and their parents never voted. So we know as educators is that, children are an extension of their family members typically. And so how do we break cycles? And that's what I'm committed to doing, is that how can we tell people that they have power when they think that they don't?
Right. So let's put a point of reference in there? Because you're a Clevelander, a native Clevelander. You've grown up here. What neighborhood were you from?
I grew up in the Lee and Harvard neighborhood.
Okay, and the reason I asked that is because I know, like, when I had a conversation, I said I grew up in the suburbs. And so for us, it might have been a different mentality. We all vote. We all, you know, we had in our community, like, we had to work for a campaign as students, be it a school levy or a mayor or a school board member, whatever it was. We had to work campaigns, so we grew up with that. But I also realized that, you know, my upbringing might have been a little different than some of the people that aren't voting. And so when we think about Cleveland neighborhoods, and in particular inner city Cleveland, and I've taught in Cleveland schools, we know what the education looks like. And so having you here from Lee Harvard was important to me, because it's not saying that it's a Cleveland thing versus the suburbs or east versus west. I mean, you get it. So as we go forward, you know, the question is, even now, how far do you go back? So you said it's generational. The grandparents might not have voted, the parents didn't vote, the kids didn't vote, and now they're teaching their next generation voting's not important. Where do you start with that? Do you try to go back and convince the grandparents? Or, like, where do you feel like that's your argument is where you start working with families?
No, you know, like I said, I've worked, you know, as a teacher, and I've worked in Cleveland, and I worked in other school districts too. And one of the things I've noticed is that my grandparents, they went to Central and East Tech. So they grew up in this neighborhood, but they left this neighborhood. So you're talking about growing up in the 1930s, 1920s, 1940s, graduating, you know, from high school in the 1940s. They grew up in this neighborhood. Then they moved to the Gold Coast, which is 105, and then they moved to the Lee and Harvard neighborhood. And so when we think about that neighborhood still is, it was number one in voting, now it's number two. And I think that it really boils down to is that I remember, as I'm thinking about it, when I was teaching during Obama's election, and I was teaching GED classes part-time, and I had people in their 60s who never voted. And one side, I kept on getting on them. I said, you know, you've been voting. I said, you've thought about all the struggles our ancestors had to encounter, and you grew up during the civil rights movement era, rather, and you are not voting. So I spend my time going over to the Electoral College, explaining the process, and they were so happy the following day. They were like, we went and voted because of you. And so those are the things that I'm passionate about. You might not, teaching and learning doesn't always occur in a classroom setting. You know, those type of things where you have an impact on individuals can happen just by having conversations with individuals. So that's why whenever time I meet someone, you know, I'm always teaching people so that in trying to just broaden their horizon when it concerns certain topics. Because a lot of times just people just don't know.
So let's go back. So when you encountered those elders that hadn't voted, what was their reason? Because you're right. You were here for the civil rights. You were here for all that transpired, even here in Cleveland, because we know from our history, you know, we had the Huff uprising or Huff riots. We had a lot of stuff that happened here in Cleveland in the 50s, 60s, 70s. What was their reason why? Did they just not know about it, or?
I think they just don't understand. I really do. I really think, as a former history teacher, I think that people just don't understand the process. You know, I'm writing this piece right now, and the importance of social studies. And a lot of times, school districts on the school districts, and also, you know, Ohio Department of Education and the United States Department of Education, they focus on math and reading. But they really need to focus on social studies, because we know typically students underperform on informational text assessments. And a lot of times that people don't know. Even right now when we think about anti-racism education, a lot of, on the federal level, they don't want to do diversity, equity, and inclusion training anymore. They want to ban the 1619 Project. They want to have this 1776 Commission. There are so many things that people just don't know about history. We've had our own concentration camps when we think about the Japanese.
Correct.
During World War II. World War II. So those are things that we have to talk about.
So you bring up an interesting point, and I'm going to go down this educator road with you, and it's been a long time since I've had on my teacher hat, but the idea of when STEM came out, so science and technology, and you're right, we did put all the efforts into science and technology, and then we made it STEAM for the arts, and so people try to umbrella the arts into social studies, humanities, what have you. But I also remember, I became a special education teacher. I wanted to be a social studies teacher because I love Constitution, government, like everything about this country, U.S. history, like that's my thing. And I remember going to teacher training classes, so we'll call it, to work on my teacher license. And they said basically like, you'll never get a job in social studies because we save those jobs for the football coaches and the basketball coaches. And that's just, and it was presented as it's an easy place to put them. Not necessarily that they're a lover of social studies, but everybody knows if you want to be a football coach, go say you'll be a social studies teacher. And that's how it was presented to me. And that was probably early 2000. But if you fast forward to that, because even when I think about some of my high school career, some of our big basketball coaches and football coaches, they were like the social studies teacher during the day. But now we're at this point of disinformation. And, I'm starting to think, before I get too far on my soapbox, can we go back to that high school curriculum where, the basketball coach who was focused on his basketball kids and making it to the championship, might not have gone in depth, or he might not have studied in depth about social studies and the three branches and all the things. I mean, talk to me about that because you've been in schools and what were you seeing with the social studies teachers either you worked with or that you experienced as a student?
So I know when I was in high school, I took AP courses, and I think it was AP Government, AP World History, and so forth. So I've always been a lover of history. But I think, and I remember one of my teachers, he used to sell candy all the time. I mean, he did teach it, but I can see where you're saying that it's not something that's promoted. It is not something that's promoted. But we can see that it is important because now people are like, oh, I didn't know that happened. I didn't know that all this happened to the blacks during the Reconstruction era.
Right.
Because there are I think, and I don't want to misquote, but I know at the minimum there were about 10 black men elected to Congress during the late 1800s. And just when people say, oh, black folks should be able to pull themselves from their bootstraps, how are they going to pull themselves from their bootstraps when they don't have any boots? Or that every time we progress, you always reminding us that we're not allowed to go but so far.
Right. And I think also when you think about that, like thinking about my own high school experience, because I did register, like it was presumed in my high school that you're turning 18, you go vote.
Of course.
Like that was the cool thing to do. You turn 16, you get your car, and at 18, you go vote. And I remember being in, we happened to have an elective class. It was African-American history. And we read the book Before the Mayflower. I had no idea of this reconstructive post-Civil War period where, as we would call it, like, it was black folks thrived.
They were thriving.
And we wouldn't have, and I never knew. And, like, when the teacher was teaching me that, like, I was kind of like, are you sure? Because, we're not taught that. But I also think that there is an emphasis in social studies that it's not a major subject. So, I can tell, and even I taught math to special needs kids. And I remember, we would push, do you know diameter? Do you know circumference? Do you know this? And most of the kids were on a track for college prep. It was a college prep high school. And I would say, like, guys, you may not be in the grocery store measuring your orange, but you got to know it. But I feel like, social studies was more practical learning. Because even now, as we hear people say, I didn't know about that, or what's the Speaker of the House do? We, those kind of things we don't know. We know pop culture that, Prince William and Prince Harry, when Prince Harry was with the monarchy, like they're in line of succession. But America has a succession line too.
Right.
And especially with our current state of affairs, the president was in the hospital a few days ago. What happens next?
Right.
And if we've not taught kids that, I think we did a disservice. And so I'm really thinking about, with you sitting here, like how many kids did we let go through this that are like, if you're still confused, were you not paying attention? And it might not have been that, in school, or were you not really taught the content?
I think there's a combination of both. Both. Because we know as students They have their strengths and they have their weaknesses. They might be good in social studies, but bad in math. So I think it's also, we have to understand that especially during this time, it's just how to incorporate, technology in daily instruction. And we know teachers are doing it now because of COVID.
Correct.
And they're doing home. So now teachers, I'm telling you, I know teachers are working harder than they have before because of the current situation. So I think that, making it interesting, make it real world applicable, so one thing I tell people all the time is that how can you relate it, how can you talk about genealogy? Because I was maybe years ago, and I'm going to go back to doing it when I have time. I did my grandmother's paternal side of the family. And I went when I was in Georgia. My family's from Washington County, Georgia. And I went down there just because I wanted to see where my family came from. But one of the people who from here who studies genealogy, she said one thing you have to know is the history. What was currently going on in that county? We know why it was named Washington County, named after George Washington. So, but we also not have to know what was going on during that time. And a lot of times we make the assumption, okay, that the slaves took their owners' names. It's not the case, and that's not always the case. That was not always the case because sometimes they decided I wanted a new name. So when we think about freemen, I'm a freeman now. Mm-hmm. Or they decided to pick names from presidents. They wanted a new identity because they wanted to embrace a new beginning.
Right. And I think, going through that, even within that point, to go through the genealogy, and I think it's going to make it real for some people. I'm hoping to create an avenue of back to voting on why this all comes together. Because I know I've had a guest on one of my other shows, and he was like, he had just done his DNA, his ancestry tracing. And you're right. For me to understand what the times were, like I know that my great-grandmother left Oklahoma. Mm-hmm. Okay. Right? Mm-hmm. But I need to know what was happening in Oklahoma. And so from there, we go back into the social studies piece of it. Was it the Dust Bowl? Was it part of the Great Migration? Was she, on a Native American reservation? And so when you go through that, it starts to put together the pieces. Like, it doesn't seem too long ago that it used to seem long ago, but now it doesn't, about the civil rights struggle. Like, that seemed ancient to me growing up. The march on, because it was before my time.
But so, it wasn't before. It wasn't, and it wasn't. You were a decade behind it.
Right. But, being in the 80s and watching Dr. King's speech in black and white, it was just kind of like, what's this old thing we're watching? And realizing how close we were still to the history at the time. But as it got older and whatever, we kind of stopped going to it because it got further away. But then, I think with Representative John Lewis's death, the thought of, you were there. Like, we have living history still among us. I mean, to me, we're connecting genealogy studies with understanding U.S. history, U.S. government constitution, because when we talk about when the amendments were made, like we celebrated, was it the 19th Amendment, the women's suffrage this year? Right. You have to realize that this wasn't the Constitution has grown.
Or I think it's, and I was reading yesterday, and they were talking about the purpose of social studies is to create people who are civically engaged and understand humanity. And I think that everyone, that's why I'm passionate about diversity. Just because you might identify yourself as white, you might be a first generation American. And so where your parents had immigrated from Russia. So you don't have the same culture as people who have been here for generations.
Right.
And so I think that's the biggest thing, is just embracing differences, understanding that we're living in a world, we're living in a country that's supposed to promote inclusivity. And I'm not sure if that's always happening. Or I don't see it anymore.
And so let's go back to that because then we go into voter suppression. Mm-hmm. And really, I mean, I want this to be a point of people wanting to vote. Like, the whole point of this series is, after hearing this, how do we get them to vote? Because it gets heavy. And it feels like things don't change because if I vote, so what? What do you think about that? Because we see from what you've just pointed out, because of something happened, we get a Ku Klux Klan, or we get a white supremacy, or we get a passage of a poll tax that we end up later repealing. What is there, talk to me about how change happens through voting for people that don't believe change happens.
So I think that, it goes back to that the understanding of government. When you see potholes in your street, when you see that you don't feel like the mayor is advocating on your behalf, your vote actually count. I grew up in the Lee and Harvard neighborhood, and when I was doing a presentation a couple weeks ago for the Cleveland Metropolitan Bar Association and the Cleveland Martial Law, and I was looking, I said, Joe Jones won by 8 points during his election, just 8 points. Mm-hmm. And I just wanted people to understand you have power in your hands.
Right.
And so when you don't like things, so just like when we talk about the prosecutor or the judges concerning the Tamir Rice case, you have that direct impact. Mm-hmm. You decide who are going to be the judges and the prosecutors. Mm-hmm. If you don't feel like your city councilman or city councilwoman is advocating on your behalf, you have the option to vote him or her out. So those are the things that directly impact you. The federal government, even so, for example, with this COVID thing, if you feel as if Congress is not advocating on your behalf during this pandemic, you directly have an impact on that. And that's what I really think that people don't understand. They don't understand that they directly decide who are going to represent us on the federal level, such as House of Representatives and senators.
And let's talk about down ballot as well, because you mentioned a lot of issues and positions that aren't necessarily federal level, but they impact you as well. Mm-hmm. And so, I know there's a common belief that Obama didn't do much for us. Like, people say that, and I'm sure you've heard that. But the other thing is, how did you vote down ballot? Because there's been times where I'm like, I'm not sure. Maybe I don't vote for this one judge position because I'm just not knowledgeable enough. But I still vote. And so I also understand that sometimes the down ballot issues are the most impactful and the most immediate to you, because who's in charge of your chief of police? Who's in charge of cleaning your streets for snow removal? Those kind of things, your mayors, your city councilmen, they're on the same ballot. So I think, the point is show up and vote, and show up and be prepared to vote. Even if you're, if this was any other election, like even if you weren't prepared to vote for such and such congressperson, you still have so many other things you're voting for, is what I'm thinking.
It is. And so I voted yesterday, and it was a wonderful turnout. I was so excited. I was just, I know out for the last couple of weeks, I felt defeated because some people were saying that they were not going to vote. But yesterday, before I came down here, one thing I did is I looked at the ballot. Who was on the ballot? I read the Plain Dealer. I looked at was it Ballopedia?
Mm-hmm.
Ballotpedia. I looked at Smart Voter. I looked at newspaper articles before I came down here to research those judges before I voted.
So I can study and say, like Jan Smith versus Mark Smith for judge. Mm-hmm. And I can read both of their platforms, but it still might be Greek to me because I might not understand. Mm-hmm. What's a way, if you are a first-time voter, and you can say go to all these places, but if I'm not government literate, as we talk about media literacy, if I'm not necessarily as well-versed in the United States government, but I want to participate, can you speak to them about, like, how to start?
So first thing that I would do if I were you, what do you think about what type of characteristics should a leader have?
Okay, and even just judges.
Judges, any type of elected official. Do they have prior political experience? Do they have a good reputation? Think about what are some good attributes of a leader. That's one thing.
Can I add one?
Go ahead.
We'll just go back and forth. I think off of that also, look for the endorsements, and are they endorsements that you recognize?
Right.
So if I like tennis shoes, and every tennis shoe company, and this is really just oversimplifying, so don't vote by tennis shoe company. If you hear that some of the things that like the newspaper that you read all the time, or the people that you listen to, the people that you follow and connect with are endorsing that candidate or that issue, that's at least giving them a second look, worth giving a second look.
Well, and not just that, because there are companies that you purchase items from where you don't agree with them.
Correct.
And so you have to, decide, are you willing to no longer purchase tennis shoes from certain companies or food from certain companies because they're political, because they're affiliated with different organizations. That's one thing. But I also look at all the political literature. And then, develop a report or, think about which issues are important to you. Is it healthcare? Is it race relations?
Right.
So one thing for me, when I was doing my research yesterday, what are you doing to focus on social justice and race relations? That is one of the things I was thinking about because we're living in this current state. Is it healthcare reform? Write down those issues and figure out which ones are important to you, and then start watching debates.
Yep. And even you can get specific within them. So
Right.
I might say healthcare, but I might be concerned with Black women's maternal health, whereas someone else might be concerned with cancer treatment
True.
or health insurance. And so even as we take, I think that's a great point, is to take some key statements like a healthcare. I'm concerned with education for my children.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what's important to you? But then really think about what is important to you. And it might be like, they might both have a healthcare platform, but one might be talking about specifically health insurance, and one might be specifically talking about children's immunities and vaccinations. And so I think that's part of it, is what's your major, what is it? Like I would say major issues or your benchmarks, and then go a little deeper. I think always it's going to be take a step deeper.
And I'm continuing to say, these elected officials work for us, not vice versa. They work for us. The president works for us. The House Speaker works for us. All these individuals work for us.
We the people.
We the people. That's why we have this government. Democracy is a government governed by the people.
So for people that are overwhelmed, and I know we're running out of time, for people that are overwhelmed with politics, government, they think that, I hear a lot of doom and gloom, on social media of it's the end of democracy. We can't do this. Our institutions are crumbling. What do you say to uplift them? Because that feeling of it's over is stopping people from not voting.
And I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think they have to know their power. We have power in these votes. And I think, just you have to figure out the progress that we've made over time. We're no longer, we're descendants of slaves. And just think about the yearning for an education that our ancestors had. And I think that, the point of the power and understanding the power of their voice, and just where they can see that my vote actually made a difference. And I know that's where they're feeling. I know many of them feel defeated because they're getting exhausted every day watching the news and so forth. But I think, having these conversations with them, exposing them to history, telling them that if, that you have the power to change who's going to be the next mayor. You have the power to change who's going to be the next city councilman. Because I think it just goes back to that education piece. I'm sorry, I constantly go back to that because education is power. It is.
So in closing, because I think you're right on, and that piece of feeling overwhelmed concerns me, and also realizing that the higher up we get from local government to national government and beyond, the change is harder to see. We can change a city councilman or a ward block president, and all of a sudden we got a street light. That's an immediate change we can see quickly because it's not as much, it doesn't have to go as far.
True.
And whereas, we don't necessarily see the change in Congress immediately. It's not like, hey, you guys were sworn in, okay, everything's new now. Like, we don't see that. And so I think that's where people get disgruntled. But talk to me about the next step. So after November 3rd, whatever the results are, my belief and hypothesis here, and you can tell me if you believe I'm wrong, is that our job's not necessarily over. Like, well, let's just go back and sleep, and then in 4 years, we'll start this whole thing again. What else should people be doing? Because the voting is the one thing, the election's another thing, but if we don't start moving again for another 4 years, like, oh, okay, it's time to vote for president. I guess it's voting happens more than every 4 years, number
True
one.
enough.
What should people be doing to stay active, involved in between these cycles? Because even in 2 years, 2 years is a long way out before we have another set of national type elections. What's the in between elections to be sharp and be ready for the next one, the training, so to speak?
So I really think right now, education is key. start volunteering and get involved in these community initiatives. We know with the George Floyd and the Breonna Taylor, figure out how you can be a part of the community. How can you get involved in your community to make a difference? Maybe you want to focus on food scarcity. You might want to volunteer at one of these organizations that are giving out free food. Maybe you're passionate about infant mortality. How do you get involved with different committees that are focusing on in that work? Even like right now, going to the communities located in Cleveland that are suffering the most, of course, are individuals residing in the inner city. How can you, help, develop programs that would help those families and those children? So I really think goes back to saying that it takes a village. So everyone, we have only one life to live, and in this life, you have to figure out what your purpose is. Why are you here? And for me, I'm here. I'm gonna use education to build bridges. I'm gonna help people become more civically engaged. You really have to figure out what is your purpose. Why did God create you?
Correct. So, Charesha, tell us how we can find you, social media, or if people want to work with you, contact you after this show.
So you can follow me at Charp Educator.
Spell that out for us.
Charp, CHARP, Educator on Instagram. You can also visit Charp Education at www.charpeducationconsulting.com. Okay. So hopefully I can look and follow me on Twitter at Charesha.
Okay, and we'll put those links into the show notes so that people can find you. And definitely, if you're someone that's looking for a trainer and to get into more of the racial equity, social justice talk, definitely I highly recommend, you connect with Charesha, because as you can see, she's got a lot to say. She's got such a wealth of knowledge, and I'm just so glad that you could join me today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
All right, thanks guys for listening. Let's vote Cleveland. Talk to you guys next time.